Mic testing. Mic test. Mic test. Mic test. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let's take this time to honor God. We praise you and worship you, O God. You are the one at work in our lives and you really care for us. Thank you for valuing us. Help us to study well. Give us good internet connection and lead us. Thank you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So acculturation was pioneered by John Schumann. So the idea of acculturation is there are social and psychological factors that affect language learning. Acculturation refers to a set of social and psychological variables that determine social contact resulting in social distance or proximity. In other words, there are factors that affect your contact with speakers of the target language. And when that happens, either you become close to them or you become far from them. When you are close to them, you learn the language. When you are far from them socially, then you are unable to learn the language. So, according to John Schumann, language is a subset of culture. Therefore, language learning is a subset of culture learning. So a learner will learn the language only to the degree that he or she acculturates. You cannot learn the language if you do not learn the culture. That's why this theory is called acculturation theory. In fact, however, class, let me just clarify that adoption of the target language group's lifestyle and values are not necessary for learning the target language. But what is important is social and psychological contact. Okay, social and psychological contact are necessary. It's the contact that's important. You don't need to follow their lifestyle. You don't need to imbibe their values. What is important is there's a lot of contact. Okay, uh, John Schumann talks about the concept of social distance, and there are several variables that have a relationship with social distance. One of them is dominance. If the language learning group is more dominant politically, economically, or socially, then it will not acquire the target language. For example, Tagalogs do not learn Visayan. That's because historically, Tagalogs are economically and politically more dominant than Visayans because Tagalogs are near the capital. The language that the Philippines has adopted is based on Tagalog. The media is spoken in Tagalog. So the Tagalogs are politically and economically dominant over the Visayan. Of course, there are a lot of Visayans who are richer than many Tagalogs, but as a whole, Tagalogs have have economic or political dominance over Visayans simply because they are in the capital. Now, the same thing goes with many Visayans because they're the ones that are at the center of politics and economics in the Visayan region. The the other tribes, the other language groups, they do not learn the language of the other groups. In on the other hand, it's the other language groups that learn their language. So the Binukid, the Manobo, and the other groups, they learn Cebuano, they learn Visayan, the version of Visayan in the capital of that particular region. So if the language learning group is more dominant politically, economically, or socially, then it will not acquire the target language. Now, if the target language group and the language learner group view each other as socially equal, it results in more social contact and more chance of the language learning group learning the language of the target language group. For example, among the Scandinavians, we have a map here of Scandinavia. We have Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. They all view each other as socially equal, so each of them learn each other's language. Okay. Another idea is both the target language group and the language learner group want the language learner group to assimilate. So both the language learner group, may be the immigrants, and the target language group, probably the language of the home country, the host country, if they both want the language learner group to assimilate, then that facilitates the learning of the target language group because both of them want the language learning group to assimilate. Then we have what we call enclosure. So if there is low enclosure, both groups expect to share social facilities. So the language learner group or anyone who belongs to the language learner group go to the social facilities and establishments that is frequented by members of the target language group. You see, class, acculturation theory of John Schumann is based on John Schumann's case study person named Alberto. Alberto Alberto was from South America and he went to the United States as a migrant worker. And Alberto didn't share the the social establishments of Americans. He didn't go to the same churches that Americans attended. He didn't go to the same schools that Americans attended. He didn't go to the same stores that Americans went to. Instead, he would go to stores that were Spanish speaking. He would go to barber shops that are frequented by Americans. Instead, he would go to barber shops where Spanish is the language. He didn't go to churches where English is spoken. And he didn't go to eating establishments frequented by English language speakers. And we can say there that there is high enclosure in the case of Alberto and the Americans. But when both groups expect and share the same social facilities, then we say that there is low enclosure. And because there's low enclosure, there's a lot of contact between between the target language group and the language learning group, which is the opposite of Alberto. In Alberto's case, the enclosure was high. There was high enclosure because he did not share the same facilities that English speakers frequented. Yeah, I hope that's clear. Now, here's another factor that facilitates learning the target language. The language learner group is small and not very cohesive. Not very cohesive, meaning they don't spend a lot of time with each other. However, if the language learning group is big and cohesive, then there will be more intra-group interaction than intergroup interaction. So what will happen is the language learner group, they keep to themselves and say they don't learn the language. An example of that class are the Koreans in the Philippines. There are many of them. The language learning group is big and they're very cohesive. They go to they go with each other. They spend a lot of time as a group with each other instead of uh, spending time with Filipinos. So they are what we call cohesive. And because they're big and cohesive, they don't learn English very much. Compare that with a group of people who are small, small in number, and they are scattered all throughout the country. They are more likely to learn the target language. So again, if the language learner group is big and they spend time with each other a lot, they will it doesn't help learning the language. It doesn't help learn the target language. But if the language learner group is small, they're only a few in number, and they don't spend so much time with each other. Instead, they end up spending time with members of the target language group, then they're more likely to learn the language. Then we also have what we call congruence. So if the language learner group's culture is congruent with that of the target language group, the language learner group is more likely to learn the target language group's culture and language. So that's the case with the Scandinavians, the Danes, the Icelandics, the Swedes, the Finns, and the Norwegians. Their culture are very similar to each other. And because of that, anyone from them trying to learn the language of the other, it's more likely for them to learn the target language group's culture and language. So the more the culture and the language are similar to that of the language learner's culture and language, the more likely they will learn the target language group. That's congruence. Another one is attitude. If both groups have positive attitudes to each other, that facilitates language learning. You are more likely to learn a language if the people speaking that language and your own group, they have positive attitudes to each other. Then we also have length of stay. If the language learner group sees itself staying in the target language area for an extended period of time, then the language learner group will likely to learn the language. Class, in the case of Alberto, you remember Alberto, he's the case study of John Schumann, upon which acculturation is built. Alberto didn't really intend to live in the United States for a long time. All he wanted to do was do his job, earn money, and go back to his country. I think he was, an apple picker, a fruit picker. Now let me ask you, how much English do you really need to do that kind of job? Pick an apple, put it in a basket, give it to your boss. Then he gives you money. Not much English. And so Alberto didn't learn English well. His English is called pigeonized because he only needed the English that would enable him to do his job. So he didn't really learn English that much. So intended length of stay is an important factor for language learning. So those factors are called social distance variables. Again, the ones we discussed, they are called social distance variables. We also have psychological distance variables. These are factors that affect your attitude in language learning. First one is language shock. Language shock is the feeling that when one speaks a new language, he or she appears comic. Of course, an adult feels like this, but not a child. So when you're an adult, you try to speak a language, a new language, sometimes you feel laughable, you feel comical, but children don't think that way. So that is not an inhibition for them. But adults, oftentimes when they try to speak the new language, they feel laughable. And in fact, there were many cases where the target language group laughs at you trying to speak their language. And I'm sure you've also had experiences where people trying to learn your language, they try to speak your language, they make mistakes and you laugh at them. So that's language shock. Then, of course, we have culture shock. Culture shock is the anxiety resulting from the disorientation encountered upon entering another culture. In that situation, the learner finds himself in a dependent state. The learner's coping and problem solving mechanisms do not work very well. As a result, activities that were routine in his or her own country require a great deal of energy in the new environment. For example, Americans are so used to buying chicken in the supermarket, it's already dressed, they just have to cook it. But when they go to another country, like in the rural Indonesia, when they buy the chicken, it's still a live chicken. They have to be the one to kill it. They have to be the one to remove the feathers, the internal organs, and finally, that's the time that they can cook it. So activities that were very routine require great deal of energy in the new environment. Or maybe like a Japanese trying to get a haircut, or he goes to a barber shop and the simple things that are in Japan, it's difficult for him. So that's culture shock. Now, because of the culture shock, it causes disorientation, anxiety, stress, and fear. The resulting mental state can produce a powerful syndrome of rejection, and that rejection diverts energy and attention from learning the second language. Instead of you spending energy and attention for learning the second language, you're disoriented, you're anxious, you have stress and fear, and that keeps you from learning the language. So language shock, the feeling of being comical when you speak the target language. Then culture shock, what you feel when you're disoriented in another culture. Those can impede language learning. Now, because of culture shock, some people retreat to familiar places where they find semblance of their own culture. And that causes high enclosure. So Koreans who are culture shocked in the Philippines, they would go to places frequented by other Koreans. Korean marts, Korean hair salons, Korean churches, because they're shocked by the culture. And so they decide to go to the places that resemble their own culture. And because of that, they don't have contact with the speakers of the target language. So it's all about contact. Then you have assimilation, preservation, or adaptation. Assimilation means you you try to become one with the culture. You accept the culture. Then you also have preservation. You maintain your own culture and language, and you reject the target culture and language. But then we also have adaptation. You retain your own culture, but you also try to accept the new culture. In assimilation class, you try to forget your own culture. Like Chinese coming to the Philippines, and they lose their own ancestry, their own heritage. Like in the case of Jose Rizal. Jose Rizal was actually of Chinese descent, but the Chinese assimilated into the Philippines. So they are Filipino culturally. That's assimilation. Okay, so assimilation, preservation. Preservation, you preserve your own culture, you reject the other culture. Adaptation, you accept you preserve your own culture, but you're willing to adapt to the new culture. Then we also have motivation. Okay, you have intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic means you really want to do something. You really want to learn the language. Extrinsic motivation refers to the rewards you get for learning the new language, in general, for doing what you want. Then in language, there is what we call functional and integrative motivations. Functional motivation means you learn the language only to the point that your objectives are met. You learn the language only because you want to use it for something. Now, that kind of motivation will end once your function is achieved. In the case of Alberto, once his function of doing his job, his objectives were met, he stopped learning English. But then there's another kind of motivation called integrative motivation. That's when you learn a language because you want to be part of the culture and society. Okay, so you decide you want to become part of the culture and society. Now, sometimes functional motivation is more powerful. Sometimes integrative motivation is more powerful as a motivation. Okay, so we have four kinds of motivation: intrinsic, extrinsic, functional, and integrative. You can actually have a combination like extrinsic, functional. For example, extrinsic, your parents want you to learn English so that you can work as a call center agent. So that's extrinsic and functional. Or maybe your parents want you to learn English because they want you to become an American citizen. So that's intrinsic, integrative. Sorry, that's extrinsic, integrative. Your parents wanting you to learn English so you can work as a call center operator. That's extrinsic, functional. Your parents want you to learn English so that you can become an American citizen. That's extrinsic, integrative. In your case, for example, you really want to learn English because you want to become a call center agent. That's intrinsic, functional. You want to learn English because you want to become an American citizen. So that's intrinsic, integrative. So you have combinations. Now, motivation can be affected by setting. For example, an integrative motivation works well in places where there seems to be no need to learn the second language. Okay, like in the case of people who want to learn the second language, who don't, there's no need to learn the second language, but they want to be part of the culture. So, like for example, US citizens, Americans who come to the Philippines, they don't really need to learn Filipino in order to live in the Philippines. They can speak English because Filipinos speak English. But if they have a desire to be part of the society, then they are likely to learn Filipino. Now, a functional motivation works well in places where there may be no need to integrate, but learning the second language is needed to deal with many people who speak the second language. Okay, Saudi Arabians needing to learn English. Um, they don't need to integrate. They don't need English to integrate because they're in Saudi Arabia. But they need to speak with many people who don't speak Arabic, but they speak English. So Saudi Arabians who need to talk with Filipinos and other nationalities who speak English, they feel the need to learn English. And so they learn English. Okay? There are other kinds of motivation: communicative, integrative, and expressive. Let's fix that. There. Okay, communicative means You want to learn a target language so that you can participate in conversation. Integrative, you want to learn language because you want to be part of the society. Expressive, because you want to make songs, come up with literature or poetry. In other words, so that you can express yourself, particularly in creative ways, in the target language. Then we also have the ego boundaries. You see, when you learn a new language, it's like you become a new person. Okay, a person who is willing to become another person as he learns the language and speaks the language has what we call high ego permeability. Permeability, ego permeability. So the more you want to, you're willing, the more willing you are to become another person as you speak another language, the more you are likely to learn that language. But if you are, for example, very patriotic, you really feel about your own culture, your own country, you're not willing to become another person by speaking the new language, then maybe you would be more willing to learn the language, much less speak the language. Okay, so ego boundaries has to do with how willing are you to become another person as you learn and apply the new culture and language. So of course, you talk about how will this affect your teaching. Um, if this was face to face, we would have done this, but this is online, so we will not do this. Now I have my own uh, Google form for checking your attendance. And because of that, I will post this in the chat. Okay, so please click that and please answer it. Okay, thank you very much for participating. Now, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. I close pa pala. Thank you. Let me open it. Try natin ulit. Try natin ulit. This one. Mali pala yung na-send ko. Can you try again? Is it open now? Ay, wait lang pala. Okay, please try again. Ayan, okay na pala. Thank you very much. There are now two responses, three responses. Thank you very much. I will close the form in 2 minutes. I think we can end the live now. Thank you very much. And you are dismissed. Bye bye.